to welcome you to Think Inside the Square. My name is Celia Pavelev and I'm the Director of Marketing and Communications at the Australia Council for the Arts. And in the spirit of today's session, I'm your virtual MC from my little house to yours. I'd like to acknowledge the Camaragal peoples, the traditional owners of the land from which I'm coming to you today. I'd also like to acknowledge the many nations throughout Australia that we're all joining from here online to talk about culture, platforms and adapting digitally. I'd like to pay my respects to elders past and present and acknowledge all First Nations peoples online with us today. This is our 7th session, which is quite hard to believe that we're that far into this little series that we created here on a Tuesday at 2 o'clock for an hour, Zoomed through Facebook Live, because I know sometimes we're asked how we're actually doing this. A little session to talk about digital solutions when we've been thrown into this very strange world that's now become our normal. We're joined again by a lovely and amazing, generous panel who are going to share some of the insights. And today we have a little focus, a rather large focus, on the Opera House and how they have pivoted, for want of using a different word, it's a word that's resonating with all of us, into the digital space at the moment. Housekeeping, as you all know, Q&A and chats down the bottom. We have presentations and from each of our panellists today, and depending on how we're going for time and how the questions are coming through, we'll either do some quick questions between each of their presentations, or I might indeed keep the questions to the end. I usually play that a little bit by ear, so please keep your questions coming in and we keep monitoring them throughout. So there's also a closed captions are available on the bottom. You'll see that there's a little icon that you can click on the bottom of the menu bar. And if there's anything else, just send us a message throughout the session. So as COVID-19 restrictions begin to ease across the country, we take a look at how one of the most iconic Australian landmarks and businesses has reacted to the crisis, how they are rethinking the future through the lens of online learning, digital programming and marketing, and how together these 3 areas support their digital strategy. So our panellists today, we're joined again by Frank Newman. Frank was with us a few weeks ago, so we're picking up a conversation with Frank that he commenced a few weeks ago. Frank's a theatre director, producer and community arts worker. Frank solves problems and takes risks. And currently Frank is the creative learning specialist at the Sydney Opera House, designing and manage the Creative Leadership in Learning, CLIL, and the Creative Play programs. Over to you, Frank.
Thanks, Celia. Hi, everybody. Welcome to this forum. It's great to be back. Great honour. Second time around. So thanks for listening. Here we go. So my little patch at the Opera House is much smaller than Stuart and Christina's, but so I'm going to be talking specifically around a participatory arts program I run called the Creative Leadership in Learning program. But very different to the main stage programming which the other guys do. So yeah, the work we do is it's an outreach program. So we're off in the community, predominantly schools, working with artists that call themselves socially inclusive artists, participatory artists. We even work with people that go by the sort of more American vernacular teaching artists. So basically we are running programs in schools to activate the creativity of schools. Creative Leadership in Learning it's a 3-year program with a school. So basically a school signs on to kind of really examine how they can use creativity in the classroom. So it's a combination of working with students through art projects, and then also working with teachers through professional learning. And we do that for 3 years, and there's some high point moments at the Opera House where they come and present works they've created at the Opera House, and they see shows and respond to shows and kind of do tours. And so use the building as a way to kind of explore creativity, but also use the shows we present as a way to explore creativity. And teachers basically take the work we do with them and then sort of think about how they can apply it. So what we're doing is really working with the notion of how can they examine their practice through creative eyes. So we were in mid-planning when COVID hit, and we had to rapidly pivot, as everyone likes to say. We were all pivoting, and we had to go online, like we've all had to. So we did that very quickly, and I'm going to cut to a PowerPoint just to sort of just show a few bits and pieces. So bear with me as So we very quickly ran a whole series of creative developments, and we used a sort of very traditional theatre development, asked a whole series of questions and got them to run a whole series of kind of workshops. And each of those workshops, we ran those workshops and asked ourselves the question, did we care about what was happening online? And we really found that kind of through Zoom, we could actually do a whole series of these exercises, which should be very traditional participatory arts workshops, to kind of drive engagement from students and to create works, create new original works. And we found that if we just shifted and adapted them slightly, we could make them really fun in Zoom. So the objective of these workshops is basically to kind of keep people employed, because people, as we all know, people's jobs were just disappearing, like water going down a drain. It was awful. And we also wanted to honour the contracts we have with schools, because schools, they needed this kind of thinking more than ever. So, because they were pivoting as quickly as we were. Here's some of the artists that we worked with. They're all amazing artists, all the different practices ranging from music through to theatre, through to dance, puppetry, and I'll talk specifically about some puppetry examples later on, and also some more physical theatre exercises. So we developed a way of kind of rating everything, because how are we to know that it worked on Zoom? And we worked a very scientific process, which we call the care factor rating. And basically, if it didn't engage us as much as this picture, if it didn't create laughter and kind of a sense of joy, and then we said, why not? And how could we really adapt everything to get to this level of deep, beautiful, tactile, kind of visceral, poetic engagement? So this is our objective. This is a sort of a beautiful picture, which we use a lot in a lot of the kind of work we do when we're describing what you get from creative leadership and learning. This is just a beautiful example of joy and everything that creativity can be. It's messy and wild and fun and colourful. So we took a whole series of, we've got 17 pages like this. This is just one page which I've cut and pasted, which is an example of some of the kind of the sort of classical theatre workshops which we tried. And you can see that yellow column is where the care factor came in. So care factor was high, or it was medium to low, or it was kind of, super high. And we went through, and then this allowed us to develop what we were calling basically a series of guiding principles. So these principles allowed us to then design our workshops for online delivery. These are the principles. So it's kind of unsurprisingly obvious that the guiding principles were smaller groups work best. If you're going to do participatory arts, then smaller groups always are going to be better. Simple is good, simple is best, kind of don't be too complicated. Whenever we tried to flip between different programmings and had kind of more complex sequenced ideas, it just didn't work as well. So sometimes the most beautiful, simple things were just people making together with music on and just cutting things up and making really simple kind of artworks. One of the key things that makes sort of this kind of participatory arts work really successfully online is regular sharing of work. So little spotlights, so constantly asking people to show what they've done. So people are put in the position of having to perform. They're on show. And so by being on show for that small moment, even in a small group, they have to kind of step up, and it drives all those kind of those outcomes that you have from taking risks and being vulnerable, and so it drives engagement. So we found that was really important to do that, literally sometimes as much as every 2 or 3 minutes, to have a little spotlight moment. We really had to focus on the rhythm of workshops, so making sure that the kind of rhythm and flow of the workshop kind of drift away and kind of go off screen and go and get a cup of tea, or just leave. And when you're working with kids, another thing is we really had to we turned up the mystery and surprise and secrets of the workshops, and I'll talk specifically about this in a second. Because the more we could make things, the more we found that engagement went up and people weren't just going to wander off and get a cup of tea. And analog and the digital, the more we could bring in things that weren't digital and kind of bring in and merge those two, pull those two worlds together, the better everything was. So they were our guiding principles. So all those artists basically use this as a bit of a sort of an analytic to make sure the workshop they're writing is going to be as good as it possibly can. And we don't pretend to be experts, but we're giving it the best shot we can. And so far, so good. So where are we up to? I'm going to talk about two specific examples. So Kay Yasugi is a puppeteer, Sydney-based puppeteer, and she's working in a school called Campsie Public School, so working with years 3 to 4, so young children. And Kay basically did a really wonderful thing. So she's a puppeteer that's used to kind of making a whole range of puppets. She has a friend of hers called Rocky, who she brings out as a sort of cheeky little character throughout the workshops as a way to kind of both challenge her and challenge the kids and create and sort of mess with the sort of screen world, mess with the screen space and kind of be a little bit cheeky. And also as a bit of a reward for the kids because they all want to see Rocky. But what Kay's done, which is really lovely, which is why I want to talk about her work, is that she's got this great setup. So this is the tradition, this is her setup. So you can see the window and there's a laptop there, which is on a box, and she sits in front of that. And that's a traditional setup of Zoom setup. But what she's done, which is different, is she's set up a second camera, which is on a phone, which looks down towards the sort of workspace on the table so that she can, so this is a close-up of that. So this is basically, this can see her hands working. So she can give an instruction and she can have both of those camera views on at the same time. She links into the Zoom link through both of those cameras so that she can choose for her audience, the kids that she's giving a task to watch her hands, or she can choose for them to watch her face. And so here's a picture of her hands working away. So she's basically giving them instructions, or at this point, just working as they're working, as she's given them instructions. So it's a really lovely setup, which allows her to be quite theatrical. She's got a backdrop as well. And she also, another thing which isn't in this picture, is she sets up some curtains in front as well. So she can open, so she can sort of open and close the curtains and reveal herself, which makes it kind of really fun and kind of exciting. And so she's constantly using this notion of a performative notion of kind of bringing in the show and encouraging the kids to do the same. So Kay's work is quite, she started very simply, little collage puppets on sticks and making more complex puppets and getting the kids to do lots and lots of performing, going back to that sort of regular showing. But a beautiful thing that she did is she cut out, she got from the teacher, she got pictures of all the kids and she photoshopped them into what looked like magazine pages. And then she slipped those pages into real magazines, which she was then going to use to demonstrate how to cut up to do her collages. And so as she was through this view, as she was opening the pages, all of a sudden the kids were in the magazine. So it was a lovely moment of surprise and magic and mystery, which the kids were like, of course, they absolutely loved seeing themselves in the kind of Who Weekly or kind of, the magazine that she'd pulled from from Coles. And so it was those kinds of things of building in those little moments of surprise, which drive engagement and sort of pull those two worlds together, the digital and the analog. So to do that, she has to make all these packs. So here she is making a whole series of packs, and they're all individualized. Each pack is different and all the kids have to open them at the same time. So there's this kind of mystery. What's in the pack? What's in the pack? What's it going to be this time? And so she really puts a lot of energy, and she puts specific things based on that child or what she's gleaned from sort of talking and conversation into their packs. So they all have different things, but she can also unify the materials. So she's building towards a palette of materials which will ultimately go and be part of her show. And she's working towards 20 weeks worth of work and kind of eventually doing a show, which will possibly be, again, we're pretty sure we're going to keep digital part of her show. It won't be entirely, we won't go back to the analog world entirely. We'll have some sort of, merge both. I'm going to quickly talk about another artist, Curly Fernandez, and he worked in the teacher professional learning space. So this is the other part of the Creative Leadership and Learning program, is we work with teachers to really help them to think about how to use creativity in their classroom. So Curly, he too was working through with a group of teachers he was basically stepping them through part of the process. And we have this kind of a series of workshops we run them through. And one of the workshops he was up to which I'm going to talk about, was called The Fertile Unknown. And this is part of an exploration which we really get them to dive into, where they have to explore deeply imaginative process. And they do this they think about artistic process so they can think and reflect on teaching process. So Curly was up to this point, and he was at home, and he set up a shirt in his laundry. And this is a picture not through the Zoom, this is just through his camera, but he set this up through the Zoom lens. And so he lit it well. He had the washing machine going on in the background. The teachers did a whole series of responsive workshops where they reflected on the shirt. They wrote, automatic writing responses. They unpacked it from a sort of social perspective, finding meaning, kind of, and looking at it from a poetic perspective. And they really spent a sort of morning responding to this work, doing drawing and writing and deeply investing in this shirt. Then they went for lunch. They came back from lunch, and Curly switched his mode from sort of workshop facilitator to slightly performative, and just brought out a big pair of scissors and started cutting the shirt up. And he started slicing it up, and he completely shredded it to this kind of, and the teachers were just devastated. To use his very polite terminology, they lost their shit. They were just completely kind of like, oh my God, they were outraged. And he then sort of went back into facilitation mode and asked them to go to these packs which he'd given them. Again, working this idea of the analog and the digital, and he'd given them these packs which they completely forgot about. And inside the pack were the same shreds of this shirt. It was a Lowe's shirt, people, so it's kind of, it was two of them. But basically, he'd set them similar shreds that he'd done in the performative moment, and with a whole series of jewelry making kind of bits of eyelets and leather and a few other bits and pieces. And the rest of the workshop was them talking about their experience of what they'd witnessed and what they'd been a part of as they made adornments and pieces of jewelry to then kind of to then wear. So again, performing those spotlight moments. So it was mixing of the digital, the analog, driving engagement, and lots of short, sharp moments to kind of, following those guiding principles of sharing. So would this have been better in the real world? I don't know. Would it have been different? Yes. It's hard to know. What I do know is that it was a deeply engaging moment for them, because they had a really big reflective session where they talked a lot about the work. So to me, that demonstrates that this is a space that can work to deeply delve into artistic experiences. It can be a place where people can share and be unified in an experience and a time and place. So it's something which we'll definitely keep investing in. We are being asked by schools to keep going, even though they're in the professional learning space. And we'll probably use this work to kind of develop a whole series we'll use this work as a way to kind of really develop a whole series of programs as we move forward. But we're definitely keen to keep playing in this space. It's taught us a lot. We're learning every time we go into a new school. So yeah, it's exciting times, really. Thanks a lot. That's me. Over.
Thanks, Frank. That was extraordinary. I feel like I underserve our audience, and I should be sending out packs to everybody so that we could be doing something a little bit more interactive and maybe a little bit more mixing that analog and that digital space. I think we might keep going on to Stu and to Christina so that we can bring questions in at the end. But before we do that, just a little technical community service. Frank was a little choppy at times, so we've seen all the messages below. We're doing everything in the back that we can do to alleviate that. So please bear with us. Do let us know if you continue to have any technical issues at the back. And we will be putting the recording of this on live on our website. It goes onto the Australia Council website a day or two after we finish doing the captioning and making it accessible and all of that. Right, okay, so moving on so that I don't take up too much more time. Stuart Buchanan is Head of Digital Programming at the Sydney Opera House, a senior arts professional in digital strategy, content and marketing. Stuart's worked with organisations, not least of which Sydney Opera House, ABC, Disney, SBS, Sydney Festival and TEDxSydney, and is founder of digital agency The Nest that has led many award-winning projects and campaigns. Stuart's going to outline the Sydney Opera House's digital program, why it was created and the changes that it needed to make as we all headed into COVID-19. Over to you, Stuart.
Thank you, Celia. I'm just going to share my screen now. Okay. Thanks, Celia, and thanks everyone for joining the webinar today. It's great to see so many people engaging. So just as a quick top line, the Sydney Opera House program throughout COVID has been dubbed from our house to yours. And we're going to show sort of two case studies today, which really kind of highlight that this is a collaboration very much between digital programming team that I lead and with the marketing team that Chris leads. And so at some point during this presentation, I'm going to flip to Chris, who's going to run through the kind of marketing side of things. But just to give you a overview about what makes up from our house to yours. So it's sort of in two key parts. As I mentioned there's the digital programming part, which we've sort of notionally called the digital season, and I'll explain why it's a season in a second. But that's made up of live streams, on-demand videos, podcasts, playlists, and so on. The reference to SOHP there is the team that I sit in, which is Sydney Opera House Presents, which is the programming unit within the Opera House. And digital content, live streams, videos, written articles, curated or created by the marketing team. And if you go to our website, you'll see it's sort of outlined with this kind of strip that you see it at the bottom there. Now, what was very, very fortuitous, and I recognize that, you know, the Opera House is incredibly privileged in a lot of different ways. And one of the things, I guess, that we were sort of fortuitously privileged with was the fact that the house had decided to give a stronger focus towards digital programming. We've been doing digital programming to some degree for about 10 years or so. Initially within kids and family space, and predominantly within contemporary music and talks, but it had been sort of disparate and a bit scattered amongst teams. There hadn't been a, if you like, digital programming department. There hadn't been a head of, which is my role, and there hadn't sort of been a centralized strategy. So I started last October and on this sort of digital programming strategy. So we were lucky in some respects that we had this essentially ready to roll when COVID hit. There were a few key things that I just wanted to kind of run through that were sort of central to the strategy. One of which was about strengthening the diversity of the work we produce. I mentioned before that, you know, kids, talks, and music were the kind of key areas. So we wanted to make sure that we diversified much more across all art forms, and then we also centralized, you know, staff and resources. We wanted to very much focus on our licensing approach. The licensing approach had sort of been, again, quite disparate. And we wanted to sort of you know, kick that into touch a little more. We wanted to create a centralized archive of recordings and also the documentation that sat with it. As you can imagine, with an institution the size of the Opera House, the filing systems are very robust on one hand, but also huge on the other hand. And it isn't necessarily a given that your digital assets in terms of your video sit adjacent to the licensing documentation. So there's actually quite a job in marrying some of those together in terms of archive work. We also recognized we needed to upgrade our production infrastructure because you know, demands of presentation are you know, getting more and more keen as we develop. And presenting the program in a way that's sort of compelling and coherent, sort of just making sure that the audience understood a lot more what digital programming was and its purpose and could get access to it across multiple different platforms. And we aim to do that within 18 to 24 months. As I'm sure I will probably say for many years to come, Louise, our CEO, is very fond of saying that we took an 18-month strategy and delivered it in 18 days. And whilst that's probably not 100% true, it feels like it. In that a lot of the things that are on this page, we accelerated incredibly quickly. we're able to kind of roll out things at a speed at which I certainly haven't seen the Opera House operate. I've never seen the institution be more agile as it has been in the last 2 or 3 months, which has been hugely exhilarating, it has to be said, to see that something as large as the Opera House can actually, when called upon, be agile and respond very, very quickly to what's happening in the world at large. So the digital season particularly, a few things. Sorry, Celia.
Sorry, do you want to just tap on the display settings at the top on the screen, and then it will just go to the full screen for you?
Is it not on your full screen?
It's on full screen, but if you go to the display settings just on the top banner, and then...
Yeah, no, I don't have those.
Arrow down on the display. Oh, okay.
You're not seeing my full screen?
It just had the other parts of the screen on there at the same time. So just, where is it gone? Slideshow? Yeah.
Can you see it full screen now?
That's it. That's
okay.
Good.
Weird, because I was seeing the full thing. So the aims of the digital season were, the phrase that I kind of used early on was like, how do we keep the lights on in some sort of respect, knowing that, you know, the Opera House, we know that it's an icon, and we know that people look to it, you know, as a kind of symbol in various different times, and so it was sort of important for us to say, well, how can we, you know, sort of recognize our kind of position and privilege in some respects, and sort of keep the lights on as something of a beacon to say, well, the arts is not going to go quietly, you know, during this, that we will do our utmost to maintain a kind of semblance of activity during this period, and particularly to maintain that shared experience of attending the arts. And so the idea was to sort of provide, as far as we could, a kind of digital equivalent of regular programming, and to present a sort of combination of stuff that was both live streamed and archives. And one of the things that we sort of decided very early on was to sort of have essentially a kind of on-demand schedule, so that in the same way that you would go previously to the Opera House website and see what's on this week, Monday through Sunday, that we would have something similar from a digital context, that we would be making material available on demand, sort of Wednesday, Thursday, Friday at certain times and so on, sort of simulating the kind of standard performance program. And the other thing was to sort of try and dovetail as best as possible with some of the existing ways of working, while also taking opportunity to test new approaches. By existing ways of working, I kind of mean, and this is something we might all reflect on, is that idea that, you know, the Opera House is set up to promote live events, and it's set up to promote things on a schedule, and it's set to promote things to, you know, different target audiences and so on. How can the digital programming sort of help to sort of work more closely in line with that way of working? So that idea of kind of digital as event, or on demand as event, was something that was in our back of our minds before COVID. Rather than, what I mean by that is, rather than just sort of releasing something, here's our new YouTube video or what have you, making sure that even if it's pre-recorded, that it's released as a premiere at a certain date and time, so that it sort of falls into that you know, event category, if you like. So there's two things, and I'll just run through these before I hand on to Chris. Archivals, that was the kind of first thing we focused on. By archivals, we mean existing recordings that were in the Opera House archive. So we initially focused on recent work that we already had clearance for. So the clearances for all of our recordings will all be different, depending on who it is and what the nature of the, you know, the agreement or the commercial relationship was. So there's probably no two events that have the same type of clearance in terms of the rights that have been assigned, or the term, particularly for those rights. So we initially focused on stuff that was already cleared, that we could basically present immediately. And that tended to be more around contemporary music recordings and also talks events. We'd just come out of our All About Women season. That was all kind of cleared and ready to go, as well as some more kind of recent high profile speakers. And we also did an initial reach out to resident companies to determine what they may have available as well. And right across all the different resident companies of the Opera House, the same thing is true in terms of licensing. All of their work will be very disparate in terms of what can and can't be shown. And you know, we whether it's our work or resident companies, one of the hardest things for digital programming is when we get audience members quite rightly writing to us and saying, oh, wouldn't it be great to see this, or wouldn't it be great to see that? And as much as we would love to present that work, and believe me, there's nothing more we'd like to do than to show that Bon Iver concert from a few years ago. We simply don't have the rights to do so, you know, and despite negotiating with artists perhaps, or looking to pay to relicense, some artists just don't want to do it. They're just not interested in having that work available for a whole manner of reasons. So it isn't a given that just because we've recorded it, we can present it. We have to be obviously very conscious of all the rights and licenses. The second phase was to engage with producers for recordings whose clearances have lapsed, i.e. we might have had the rights to screen something for 12 months or 18 months, and it was sort of going back to them to relicense that. Or that we had licensed it purely for schools. So we had maybe 5 or 6 kids' theatre shows that had been filmed and licensed to be shown to schools, but not licensed for general public. So we went back to them and negotiated with them to clear the licenses to present those as part of the program. And that's been a really lovely thing to see, because there's a few European theatres works that were presented at the house that we've managed to negotiate clearance for, which is exciting. One of the, as I mentioned, the digital programming strategy was sort of in its nascent stages when COVID hit, but what we had done was we had actually started to, and we had made considerable inroads into cleaning up the archive. So during that process in January and February of this year, we'd actually identified a few pieces of older work that we already had clearance for, but for one reason or another was never broadcast. And you know, there's probably good reason for that, even though the licensing, you know, terms might be available on your server or whatever. The people who were negotiating that, in this case, they'd moved on, and there simply wasn't that kind of information knowledge trail to say that piece that's 5 years old is cleared, by the way, and you can run that anytime. So sort of actually uncovering a lot of that was pretty fascinating. I point to Olafur Arnalds there as one of those finds. His show was maybe 5 years ago, and we were cleared to show it. That went up last week or week before last. And Olafur himself was very excited to see it back out there again, and was very supportive of the work. And the last piece, I think, in terms of archivals, which has been really fun to work on, has been to repackage archive recordings in new ways. We have a series that we've shot, the opera shot many years ago, called Nooks and Crannies, which was artists filmed in various pieces of the building. They'd previously been released as kind of 6 short films, and we edited those together into one new long film. We're just about to do another one this Friday, where Ben Marshall, who's our head of contemporary music, has chosen some of his highlights over the years, and we packaged that into a kind of Rage style kind of 45-minute program. And we're doing something similar with our Badu Gilly work next week. So that's a kind of, you know, an interesting approach, using material, because in those particular cases, as may be true in your case, we have contracts that historically have allowed us to film 5 minutes of material for promotional purposes, but not to release the full show. So with the example of Ben's piece coming up this week, we're using those 5 minutes of those shows. We can't show the full thing, but we can show 5 minutes and package that together into a new program. So sort of taking advantage of that promotional clause. And then finally, the thing that's you know, been really exciting to be able to do is to establish a temporary venue within the house that's set up to record and live stream events. And here's the image taken from above. It's on stage at the Joan Sutherland Theatre. We have 5 cameras set up permanently there, or at least, you know, during COVID, to be able to record and live stream work from the stage. That means that we can now really diversify the season, so we can actually start to stage things that we don't have in our archive. We don't have a lot of comedy or cabaret, for example. We don't have a lot of dance. So we're able to kind of, you know, stage that and record it. It also gives us the opportunity, obviously, to promote and financially support local artists, where we're giving them a gig, essentially, putting them on stage and paying them for their time, and then, you know, broadcasting that through our channels, and also supporting the staff and crew by maintaining our on-site activity. And I have to say, and again, I fully understand the privilege that we have of being able to do something like this, but being on site and being in a venue, staging an event, having not done so for 2 or 3 months, the feeling is quite extraordinary, I mean, the positivity around the whole crew is just quite unlike anything I've experienced. Everyone's so happy to be there and really supportive of the project. And this is how we do it. So we access the venue 1 day a week, which is a Saturday. And on that day, we stream one thing live, and we also record another one. So we do 2 events, which is pretty fast in terms of get in, get out. But as you can see from those photos, it's very stripped back. And that's the intention. So the performances are very modest, no frills. There's no sets and costumes. The production spec is exactly the same. So basically, we had a production spec and we've given it to all the artists and say, whatever you do, it has to actually fall within this spec. And if it can't be done, you're going to have to adjust accordingly. And that's partially through necessity, because a lot of our suppliers are closed. You know, we can't get access to, you know, specialist equipment and so on. But just as well as being able to sort of do that in a very kind of fast turnover kind of way. And we also understand that there's certain genres such as cabaret, comedy, etc., that are more ready for that kind of black box space, whereas others might take advantage of constraints to present something unorthodox. I'm looking forward to presenting a couple of very interesting things in the coming weeks. We've got a punk band in this Saturday, which will be quite an interesting contrast to the jazz band we had last week. And we're also going to be staging some contemporary dance at the end of June. And that'll be very exciting to see too. So that's a kind of quick overview, quickish overview. Yeah, happy to take questions at the end.
Thanks, Stu. Chris, did you want to go straight on from there, or?
Yes, I will, and I'll just share my screen from where Stu had left off. So tell me if you guys can see this okay.
Oh, I've just lost my little script with your little intro in it. Oh.
Is that all right? Do you see what I'm seeing here?
Yes, but you do need to go into the display mode again.
Yep, there we go. Okay, so Stu sort of mentioned this at the start. I'm pretty sure it was 18 days. I think that we went from going, oh gosh, we need to pivot, as Frank said before, and we want to continue to engage with our audiences, you know, our digital audiences. We should be treating just as importantly as our physical ones. I think it was 18 days. And what we sort of found in working with Stu was we obviously were moving so quickly through it that we kind of caught ourselves 3/4 of the way through and said, all right, have we really articulated our kind of more short-term objectives as well as our long-term objectives? Because doing a program like this and putting it out into the world, you know, you can't really launch it once, and we didn't want to find that we got you know, weeks and months into it and then we suddenly realized we didn't set ourselves up for success from the start. So we worked really closely with him over several nights to kind of go, all right, how do we take what you're wanting to do, Stu, artistically around the digital season and where we can support and further engage audiences from a content perspective to make sure that we kind of had aligned our objectives. So a big focus for us in the short to medium term was, you know, how do we find a way, if we can, of reaching new Sydney-siders to kind of grow awareness and consideration of Opera House's offerings as a whole. A big bit of it, of course, as Stu's already mentioned, was maintaining relevance during shutdown and how do we respond to, you know, how does Stu respond, as I'm sure he's already mentioned, artistically to what audiences are wanting to see, but from a marketer's perspective, how do we make sure that the kind of content that we're making hits the right notes as well? Providing a positive alternative experience to audiences, and making sure that we share a range and volume of offerings to offset that lack of a live experience. And then long term, of course, we were kind of like, all right, how do we make sure that in doing this, you know, we're creating this kind of curated experience? And when you're working across, you know, multiple different channels, whether that's Facebook or YouTube or, you know, whatever that might be, Instagram, you know, you're obviously needing to create content and putting out offerings into those different environments, but it's very hard then when you're working across different across different content formats, whether it's Stu's, you know, live streams or on-demand content that we're posting through YouTube, or whether it's a written form article, to kind of curate what a holistic offering looks like. So at the moment, we've decided to make that hub happen on the Sydney Opera House website for us. So we were thinking, how do we make sure then that we're driving that traffic to our website so that people can experience those offerings as a whole, and so that when we move towards reopening, there is that familiarity of engagement with our site to then be able to see what physical experiences we're returning with. Our other objective was growing awareness and consideration of new audiences for our products. That's a bit of a not showbiz term, but, you know, at the Opera House, we do lots more than just shows. You know, we've got live tours and experiences, food and beverage offerings, so we kind of refer to it like that. And then, of course, how do we deepen engagement and brand affinity with our audiences, which links back to that relevancy point I mentioned before. And then use the kind of content and programming opportunity that we have right now to understand interests at a customer level, so that we can sort of take those and respond to them as we move out the other side of this. So as Stu mentioned at the start, the weekly release of his digital season is then supported with the marketing and communications department within the Opera House, creating a series of content, as you mentioned, things like written articles, videos, photo essays, whatever that might be. And we sort of identified through this sort of principles that we had that would deem it appropriate to then be included in that weekly release. So the first one, for example, is how do we make sure that we create that deeper experience for audiences by highlighting content that complements and directly aligns with that season. So, for example, I think it was last week, we had a talking through a crisis talk with our head of talks and ideas, Edwina. So we worked with her, with several members of the marketing communications team, to work with her to say, okay, could we also do a written article that looks at what long reads you're tapping into right now that is helping you navigate that, and had a written article that then sat to accompany the season work. That second point around principle was, how do we again make sure that we are showcasing that breadth of program experience, food and beverage, building heritage, because the Opera House is so many of all of those things. So the team, from a Marcomms perspective, where we have a steering committee each week, is we look at everything that's happening and go, okay, do we have fair representation here of the whole representation of artists, of faces, of voices, etc., as well as the kind of the building and the icons makeup, if you will. So again, as an example, we've often turned to the National Film and Sound Archives to kind of pull out some heritage aspects of stories that we think haven't been necessarily told as often at the Opera House. And one that we realised we hadn't told before was the fact that actually one of the first performers at the Opera House was actually a female ragtime pianist. So we worked with that content to sort of tell that as a written story and photo essay. And then finally, content that is relevant and engaging to audiences during this time, and that's appropriate for us to distribute. There's a lot of research kicking around out there, some of which the Australian Council has been championing, which is really fantastic. But the thing that we kind of put back on our marketing and comms team as we're kind of going through this cycle each week of working in a writer's room and thinking about how we can make this content that's engaging is, what are people really wanting to hear and respond to, and where is it right that the Opera House does that? You know, when there's no point in us making something that somebody else is better exists to create, but where can we strike those right notes? So, for example, several of the talks that Stu put out as part of the season was with Yotam Ottolenghi and Nigella Lawson. So we were like, great, okay, we know as well there's this trend that people are doing in isolation, which is increasingly cooking your own food, baking, etc. So we've done several pieces in a written form that look at those sorts of trends, and Opera House staff picks of popular Ottolenghi recipes. And you know, when we're tapping into things that are relevant, what we're finding then is we're getting really great page views and engagements around that content, because we think we've hit that right note from a relevancy perspective. And then from a Marcomms strategy, just a very top level snapshot, you know, we were looking at like, what are those key messages that align with the objectives that I just spoke to? You know, how do we show that breadth? How do we keep playing our part in making sure that we're accurately reflecting the breadth of the arts and culture that's Stuart's programming digitally? And how do we make sure that we enable that kind of community connections that exist, or that we want to be facilitating as best we can as a community meeting place, even virtually at this time. We've identified target audiences for us, and then we sort of set some high-level campaign objectives. So the first one that we really teased out was, how do we drive the live viewing of the season content by mirroring physical experience opportunities? And again, Stu's kind of referenced some of those, but how do we as marketers and communication specialists encourage people to make an occasion of it and encourage conversations, interactions with one another through platforms that we're utilising to stream things? Then a bit of an unusual one for us as performing arts marketers was continuing to optimise awareness and visibility of on-demand programming and content. So what we kind of caught ourselves on quite early was, in arts and culture, you know, we're so used to, as marketers and comms people, building towards an opening and then having a season and then it ending, and then we learn and we move on. Whereas with Stu's season, each week we get more and then we get more and then we get more, and we're kind of exponentially growing, and the seasons never end. And so for us, that kind of growing on-demand backlog, we suddenly found, okay, how do we make sure that we are using that in the right way for him to get those eyeballs and to get that engagement. And one of the ways that we've identified that as an objective now is to kind of, you know, how do we represent that breadth? Yes, but then identify the kind of popular and high performing programming and content as sort of halos to then draw people in to continue to get that engagement and awareness with the whole offering of From My House to Yours. And then finally, you know, obviously we're in a time that budgets are really, really limited. And so we're fortunate again that we have some great channels at the Opera House, and we've cultivated some really strong communities. So how do we leverage those, and how do we make sure that we are testing and learning things so that we can, you know, use channels that cost us nothing in a way that drives really great engagement. And to give you a little flavour of kind of what that looks like across owned, earned and paid, here's a little visual snapshot of the owned channels. So as I mentioned earlier on, the website's become a really key hub for us, and that was an unusual process in and of itself, because the Opera House website, you know, largely is built as an e-commerce platform. Yes, we've had content previously, but we've never had it to the breadth and scale that we've got going on right now. So in that kind of 18-day window, a lot of the people in my team are working with technology to kind of go, okay, we need to rebuild components on the website completely to be able to put in multiple video files side by side, all that kind of stuff. Our weekly newsletters, we've got a really great database, but again, it was all kind of created around driving click-through to sell shows and experiences. And so we had to reframe the user experience of that, that online newsletter to be able to more effectively profile content and programming. We're targeting tactical EDMs through our database, where we know that there are interests alignments with our audiences to drive engagement with that content. A hell of a lot through social, whether that's as at Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, LinkedIn. Weibo is also something that we've continued to focus on while our audiences from China aren't able to physically be here. That there's, you know, a lot of engagement through that platform. And that sort of weekly focus across socials is really key. As I mentioned, that growing on-demand sense has been so important, and finding the right kind of assets to profile that release for us has been heavily in video and editing that content internally at the Opera House. Through earned channels and with our, you know, really talented colleagues in the comms team, they've done a great job around getting some excellent editorial coverage for us. And telling the kind of stories about how the Opera House has continued to engage and profile our arts and culture to our audiences. We've worked a lot with our partners, and that's been a really, really important thing for us. Again, we're lucky that we've got some great corporate partners, resident companies, you know, artists themselves who want to profile their works and their efforts. And so that's been very fortunate to kind of amplify that for us, industry support and artist support, as I mentioned. And then, you know, we have invested in a modest sense through paid channels, which, you know, online heavily, because you can be really, really efficient with your spends there and spend a little and get a great reach. And we've done that. Yes, we've touched on outdoor a little bit through some very tactical placements where we knew that people were still going, you know, grocery stores, etc. A little bit on community radio, but then the rest has been really much skewed towards online to continue to get that engagement. And that is the end of my presentation part.
Thanks.
Stop share so I can see if there were questions. Sorry, I couldn't see as I was in full screen.
Thanks, Chris. No, I think everyone has actually been so engrossed with all of your presentations collectively. It's been quite extraordinary. Thank you. There's so much to get to. But there was one question I did trawl back, which I don't want to miss, for Frank, is what technology is used by schools in Queensland? Zoom is booked by EQ. So are you able to?
Listen, I don't know specifically, but all I know is that none of what I mentioned has anything to do with a specific platform. So whether it's whatever, I'm talking about video conference platforms basically, so whether it's Teams, Zoom, whatever, it's all the same. The guiding principles apply to all. So I'm not sure that specific question around Queensland. Sorry. Yeah, I have to go to the Department of Education website there.
No worries at all. We've all pivoted, as we've said, sort of very quickly, and that 18 days kept coming up a few times throughout the presentations. What do you think, like in the long term, knowing that we've all done this very quickly, we've all been very creative, we've all drawn from what we know of our audiences now, and we're all guessing a little bit about the future, about the mix of being physically there for an experience and then also experiencing these works online. What do you think are going to be the long-term impacts on your audience, or are we at that stage yet?
Yeah, look, it's a really good question, because, you know, I'm not one for sitting still myself. And so I'm, you know, already thinking to, you know, when we get back to, you know, normal reality, we've managed to be really bold right now, as have a lot of people, but how do we maintain that? You know, how do we, when we're in September, October, or whenever it is that we're sort of being able to stage events, how does digital programming integrate in a really meaningful way at that point, and doesn't just sort of you know, fall back to where we were last January, like we've been given a really clear opportunity, you know, and I'm not the first person to conflate COVID with opportunity, and, you know, part of me apologizes for doing so. But, you know, as I said before, the Opera House has been super agile, and so it'd be a shame to kind of get back into business as usual and just to revert to, you know, how we did it before. So I don't quite know exactly what it will look like, but I think this idea of having content appear on a schedule, certainly not at the rate we're doing now. We can't maintain 4 or 5 nights a week forever. But, you know, when we're back to putting on events, at least having some sort of parallel schedule of releases, maybe that's 1 a week or something like that. I don't know. But certainly sort of keeping up that momentum so that we're have the offering, the digital offering that's there consistently and is easy to find. So that's kind of, I haven't thought much more beyond that. But, Chris?
I was going to say, I'd add to that, Stu, because I know you and I had a conversation around this the other day, but you know, I think it's no surprises to anyone when I say, you know, that there's a place for both to really coexist, and they both have a really important relationship together, and that we know that digital experiences, performances, content, you know, offer accessibility to artists or performers or audiences who might not be able to physically come to our venue and experience us. Same goes for the Opera House when you think about the fact that, you know, we're an icon, yes, we're a physical location, but we have audiences globally, and there are going to be people that want to be able to still connect with what the Opera House does, where they can't necessarily come to our city and might not for some time. So I think that, yeah, I've always been of the opinion that the two are so important to be working together in that sense. And also, I guess, at the moment, in the way that Stu's been programming, that content is, you know, is free, is, you know, available frequently. And I think audiences are more willing to experiment and try things they haven't tried before when they're able to do so at the click of a mouse, from their phone, from their tablet, from their TV. And that's a great opportunity for us and for Stu's programming to help shift people's perceptions around what it is that the Opera House actually does. Because you mentioned it before, Sydney Opera House Presents, there's this huge internal programming team at the Opera House where we work with artists and presenters around Australia, around the world, to bring shows to our stages, as well as all the great work of our resident companies and commercial hirers. So it does allow people, audiences, to experience genuinely the full breadth of what the Opera House has to offer.
And do you think, Bridget Jones has asked a lovely question. Are you able to tell us a little bit about the new audiences that you
Yes.
on the digital platform?
Oh, that's another one. So I would absolutely love to be able to say, I mean, my dream, I'm an insights data nerd, and my dream would be able to say X percentage, X number of new audiences have engaged. It's really hard, right? When, you know, unless there's a connection between the data set that is our CRM and our transacting customers and the person who is then watching that content, there's no true way of having completely connected those dots. So from a marketing perspective, what we're really doing is making sure that with our organic activity and our paid activity that we are channeling that towards reaching new audiences, that we're using our own channels, our database, etc., to reach our existing ones. And then we've tried to sort of, again, at the speed that we're in, is find some hacks to get those answers. So what we've done in the last week, I think it was the last week, Stu, is we've launched a survey that people can elect to fill out themselves on the sydneyoperahouse.com digital program page, and at several touch points, so that we can start to capture some top level information about someone. Did they experience the program? What parts of the programs did they experience? And have you come to the Opera House in the last 12 months? Have you ever come to the Sydney Opera House? So we can start to put a little bit more colour around that.
I'd only just sort of quickly say, like, more from a qualitative feedback, when most of our work has a live chat function, or is presented with live chat on YouTube, so we're able to see sort of feedback in real time. A couple of things that have really stood out for me is people who've said, I didn't know the Opera House did X, Y, and Z. You know, there are some, you know, we essentially do everything in the Opera House, of all art forms, of all scales. Yeah. But I think for a large percentage of audiences, they're not necessarily aware of the depth and breadth of the things that we present. So it's been really nice for people to say, I didn't know you did X, Y, and Z. Yeah. Or the second one, which is, I always intended to see X, Y, and Z, and I never did, and now I'm watching it digitally, and it's fantastic, and I'll make sure that I come. So those kind of comments, which are, you know, appearing in the live chat, do sort of, you know, give us the assurance that, you know, that our audience, even if that's necessarily existing audience, but you have to remember that, you know, for the majority of people who come to the Opera House, I mean, I think on average, once you average it out to the many hundreds of thousands in Australia, it's sort of right about once a year, you know, so it's, you know, that might be one thing that you'll come and see, that there's many other things that we do that hopefully the program is exposing you to. But you might already be an attendee, it's just we're broadening their sort of consumption.
Sweet. Yesterday, I know this panel is very aware, and I hope the audience and the attendees are aware as well, pattern makers Wolf Brown and I think 6 collaborating government agencies released some research yesterday, the Audience Outlook Monitor. So I know the data nerds in us and that DNA in us is gobbling that up about what audiences are doing, and when they're happy to come back, and to your point, Stu, the things, they are happy to try different things at the moment, and people are passing and sharing some of that information around. I know there's a lot to unpack in that research. It's on the Pattern Makers website. There's a dashboard to go, and there's a number of fact sheets in there as well. And
it's so good, Celia. It's so good. I've gotten deep into that this morning. Like, I fell into a massive data hole.
I spent my weekend in it looking at, and it's the first phase of it too. So we'll be looking at, and the thing about this time is, we just spoke about the 18 days before. 18 days is a long time ago now from when we first went into this, isn't it? And we were looking at, like, we've all changed, we've responded, there's a whole, we've all adapted. So our audiences will be adapting too, when we need to stay abreast of that and stay really in touch with what the appetites are and the behaviours, and how everyone's actually responding to that as well. I know time is up, and I have been very strict on time with these sessions. I'm sorry. So I know that there are some additional questions coming through. I think our panellists may or may not have time to hang out on Facebook a little while longer. I do have to give an unashamed plug for something that we have coming up that is indeed on the Joan Sutherland stage. The Stiff Gins on Wednesday the 27th of May are doing a performance as part of the First Nations Arts Awards, which is being broadcast live through our website. There'll be a URL. It's an event cast piece coming through. It's the first time that we've been able to share this event because of COVID-19. So, Stu, to the point before about opportunities, I'm trying to think of the silver linings that this piece of history is giving us. And this is one of those things that has afforded this event to be opened up to a really extraordinarily broad global audience. So if you're not doing anything at 6 o'clock on Wednesday, the 27th of May, I encourage you to join our celebration of our First Nations artists that evening. Check out the Pattern Makers research if you can this week. don't forget the other offerings, Creative Connections webinars that we have this week. I think tomorrow there is a Instagram session, and then on Friday we hit a milestone 10th First Nations roundtable at 2 o'clock on Friday afternoon, which is extraordinary. That for 10 weeks in a row, the dedication and the commitment to ensuring that we're connecting. And again, another silver lining from COVID-19 is that ability for us all to connect and talk about creativity, arts, culture, and our solutions in this time to get us through to the other side, which I think we're heading to with great rates of knots. Anyway, I'll sign off from now, but thank you again to our very generous panelists. We could talk for hours, and I think we probably might need to pick up this conversation again. So Frank, you're coming back for a third time, my friend, I think, sorry. And Stuart and Chris, if you'd be willing to come back again, I think there's a lot more to talk about. But thank you everyone for joining in. If you
Thank you.
Thank you.
get to it, but yeah, we'll see you all later. Bye.